A return to the homeland, stirring up mixed emotions for these men. They were asylum seekers, now back in Kabul after being deported from Germany.
Because
I went to Europe, I lose everything. Everyone loves their country. I also love my country, but what should I do here?
Matti is one of the hundreds of thousands returnees expected to head back to Afghanistan this year. Meanwhile, there's an armed conflict which is displacing around about 1,500 people every single day. I'm Femi Okay.
I'm Malika Bilal. Today we look at the life that will greet returning refugees and the conditions of the 1.5 million Afghans who are displaced but unable to leave the country.
Decades of fighting and natural disasters have made Afghans one of the world's largest refugee populations. An estimated 2.7 million Afghan refugees are living outside the country. Just last year, more than 500,000 people fled their homes following intensified violence between NATO-backed Afghan forces and the Taliban.
Many refugees are being forced to return to Afghanistan because their host countries are fatigued by the economic and social pressures of sheltering them. Growing xenophobia in these countries, as well as rough living conditions in refugee camps, are some of the other reasons for the influx of returnees. The experience can be debilitating, especially for young Afghans. Many were born outside the country and will step foot in Afghanistan for the first time.
So how are Afghans dealing with this, and is there a long-term strategy for them? To help us talk about this, on set we have Noorjahan Akbar, founder of the Free Women Writers Collective. That's a group promoting social justice in Afghanistan. Javed Faisal is the deputy spokesman for the chief executive of Afghanistan in Kabul. Naseem Majidi is a migration expert and the founder of Samuel Hall. That's a migration think tank. She's currently in Nairobi, Kenya. And Abdul Ghafoor is the founder of the Afghanistan Migrant Advice and Support Organization, or AMASO, in Kabul. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to say that our two gentlemen who are sitting in Kabul, there was a 6-second delay. So audience, don't worry about it, don't panic, they haven't disappeared. You will hear that delay in our conversation today. Let's start with Naseem though. Naseem, 4 youngsters here sitting on my laptop. They're all from Afghanistan. What's their story? Why is it so pertinent to what we're talking about today?
I'm glad you're starting with this photo. This photo was taken in August 2016 at the Iranian-Afghan border, where I was doing a research with my team on Afghans deported from Iran. And we've been talking a lot about returns from Europe and returns from Pakistan, but actually the largest number of returns is coming from Iran. So let's say that approximately 1 million people were returned last year, and another 1 million will be returned next year. Out of that, 40–50% are actually from Iran. And the dynamics in Iran are pretty concerning because 15% of returnees, deportees from Iran, in our research done with the Norwegian Refugee Council, are actually unaccompanied minors. They're between 10 and 17 years of age and have been through detention, deportation, and show extreme protection needs when they return to Afghanistan. So the 4 gentlemen, the 4 young men you see there are 14 to 17 years of age. They all come from the same village, but have no money to go back home.
Javed, this isn't necessarily front page headlines or top of our news bulletin, but Afghanistan, who controls what? This is a good reminder to our audience about what's going on in Afghanistan. All the areas here that you see grey, government controlled. The areas that you'll see that are in the black, Taliban controlled. The red areas, contested areas. This shows you, let's just look at those red areas and the black areas. That shows you where the instability is in Afghanistan right now. What impact is that having, Javed, for you, for your government, being able to help people who are displaced within Afghanistan and people being pushed back into Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think this IDPs is an issue for us, and at the same time, the returnees is also a big challenge for the country. While we are dealing with the IDPs, we have to be making sure that we are taking good care of the returnees. But insecurity definitely is a problem, and the insurgency is causing this problem even greater extent. What we have been trying to do this year, we are making sure that the people who are internally being displaced, that we are taking good care of them, and at the same time, the people who are being forced to come back to Afghanistan, they have shelters and they have access to health and education services. But in the same time, we have to be making sure that the people who are being displaced internally and the people who are coming back, that they are safe and secure, because the first reason for them to leave Afghanistan was the insecurity, and if there is no security here back home, I think they don't have a reason to come back home. But it still is a challenge, and we expect insurgency, and we hope that they will make sure that the civilians of this country are being protected, and
Sure.
that civilians are not being used as shields in the war.
Javed mentioned where people are being forced to, where they're being deported from. And earlier you heard Naseem say that Pakistan, Iran, and of course Europe are those places. I want to share a tweet from Shuja Rabbani. He says, "It's shameful to see the EU deporting Afghan refugees when once upon a time many Europeans themselves were refugees going around the world." I want to pass this to you, Ghafoor, because I know that you have experience in this very matter. You were one of those deportees. What did you face?
The security situation in Afghanistan, the current security situation, is the biggest concern, of course, for returnees, both coming from European countries or the neighboring countries. As a result of which, most of those who have either been deported or have chosen to come voluntarily are remigrating. They are leaving the country again because they don't feel themselves secure in the country. Look at the outreach of Taliban. Look at the existence and the outreach of ISIS. These are some new. For example, ISIS is a new virus today to all the Afghan citizens, especially those who are returned. Most of them, they have never been to Afghanistan. They have been born and raised, for example, in Iran or Pakistan. So today they are being returned to a country where they have never been a part of. They have never seen anything about or known anything about the country. So it is security is, of course, the biggest issue for returnees, which is causing them to remigrate and leave the country as soon as they can.
Nur Jahan, people don't always have this option about returning home. Sometimes they're just pushed back. So some of the returnees are coming from Europe, some of them are coming from Iran, some of them are coming from Pakistan. They end back in Afghanistan. Then what do they do?
Well, this is a crisis in Afghanistan. Actually, the UN recently asked for increased funding for the costs of providing shelter, providing food, providing health services for these returnees, whether they are have come back by force, they've been deported, or they chose to come back. Because inside the country, the infrastructure does not meet the needs of the influx of returnees.
All right, so let's spell that out, because people say infrastructure and expect everyone to know what that means.
Yes.
So when say you've been living in Pakistan, you're heading back, you've been told you have to go back to Afghanistan, you end back in an IDP camp, an internally displaced persons camp, just outside of Kabul. What do you mean by infrastructure?
So access to healthcare, for example, is a really major part of this problem. Around 50% of Afghans in general don't have access to quality healthcare. And then you're in a camp, usually they're...
So I want people to understand exactly what's going on here. Quality healthcare. Yes. So your kid gets sick, what happens?
A lot of the time, nothing. People resort to traditional methods of fixing the problem, which doesn't really necessarily help in some cases. And I think this is really important, especially when it comes to women's health, because not only is the lack of access is a problem, but also the cultural barrier, where many families don't feel that, they're in a new environment, they don't know the doctors, they don't know the community, they don't feel safe for women to go to a doctor. For example, recently the NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, did a research specifically on Afghan internally displaced women and girls, and around 50% of them said that they didn't have the permission to leave their tent or the makeshift place that they're living in to go to the doctor. That lack of access to healthcare puts women's lives in danger. Afghanistan already has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, and then on top of it add a layer of being marginalized further by internal displacement, and it's a really dangerous situation.
So you mentioned healthcare being one of the challenges that people face. Security, though, is another one. This is a video comment that we got. Naseem, I'll pass this to you. This is Ali Latifi, who's a freelance journalist and a former Al Jazeera colleague, and he talks about what refugees face when they get back to Afghanistan. Have a listen.
There are two central issues facing Afghan refugees that have been deported, whether they've been deported from Pakistan and Iran or from the EU. The first one and the most obvious is security. We see that civilian casualties are going up and that the cities remain under attack. Secondly, the issue is a lot of people get deported to Kabul. Everyone gets deported to Kabul, but very few know anything about the city, and there is no system to sort of prepare people for that or to help them along the way.
So Naseem, have you talked to people for who that's the case? They land in Kabul, and then what happens?
Of course, I mean, to go to the first point on insecurity, this is touching everyone's lives, whether it's minors being deported or adults being deported. I'll give you a few examples. I was speaking at the Iranian border again with an adult male worker, and everyone likes to say that migration to Iran is mainly economic migrants, so we don't need to protect them. They're going out of their own choice to Iran. But when they return, when they're deported 8 years after they first left, and their village is now in the hands of the Taliban and they can't go home, they become also internally displaced, unable to go home to their families or for example, to Baghlan city in the case of this one man I interviewed. They're stuck in Afghanistan, internally displaced, or they fall in the hands of smugglers or traffickers who take them back to Iran. So even these men who are broadly spoken about as economic migrants are not economic migrants. They're people who are suffering from the consequences of conflict and war. To go back to the second point on dumping everyone back in Kabul city, I mean, yes, a lot of the returns from the UK, for example, consider Kabul the safe space in Afghanistan where we can return people. But Kabul has grown from 500,000 to 5 million people in about 15 years. How can we expect one city to absorb so many people? Remember that Kabul city is 70% informal settlements with lack of planning and
Naseem, that word dumping is very telling. Do you feel that people are literally being dumped?
Yeah. I mean, when they return, wherever they may be from, whether their families are in Iran, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, whether they're from the north, the east, the south, or the west, they're returned to Kabul from Europe. And then they're asked, more or less, to find their own way and to manage on their own. But Kabul city is not like London or Paris where you can arrive and rent your own apartment. You need networks, you need social networks, economic networks. Returnees don't have that. So what you see, and we did a research study on urban displaced youth, and we published it last year, depression hits them very hard. 70% of the youth we interviewed, no matter their migration status, suffer from trauma. But deportees are 50% less likely to even have access to any healthcare.
Let me just share this. Thanks, Naseem. I want to share this headline here from The Guardian because, Abdul Ghaffar, this is something that I know you can totally relate to. Here's the headline. EU signs deal to deport unlimited numbers of Afghan asylum seekers. That was you a few years ago. What is it like to feel that you're in Europe, you're living in Europe, you feel you have got out of your dangerous situation, and then you're taken back?
Well, the thing is that when you leave your country, when you seek asylum, when you ask for protection, there are some international instruments that need to be respected. But looking at the situation of Afghan refugees, especially in Europe, they are mainly being marginalized, especially in the past few years. They are being marginalized. Their cases are not being inspected or reviewed, thoroughly. As a result, they choose to deport those people back to a war-torn country, a country which is struggling in many sectors, be it security, be it high ratio of unemployment. So for an Afghan or for an asylum seeker who choose to go to a European country and seek asylum, and today he is being returned to a country where he have never been a part of.
Javid, I hear you speaking at the same time as Abdul Ghaffar. Just repeat what you said because we didn't hear it.
Yeah, what I was trying to say, like he mentioned earlier about the cases, he was saying that Afghan refugees are being marginalized in Europe. I would just like to add here that based on the new MOU we have signed with the EU, each case of the Afghan asylum seekers or refugees should be investigated separately and individually. Before the signing of the MOU, there were specific categories for the Afghan refugees in Europe, and the governments, the nations were looking at that through categories. But after the signing of this MOU with EU, now each case is being investigated separately and individually, and each one of those refugees have the right to have a lawyer and have their case investigated separately, which means each one of them will have the right to stay there, and if they don't fit or qualify in the categories that the EU nations have set for the refugees, they will be returned back to their home country, Afghanistan. But if they do sit in one of those categories, they will have the right to stay there.
And so if they are returned back, as you say, one of the obstacles people say they will face is the lack of something to do once they are in Afghanistan. It's the lack of employment. This is Sayed on Twitter, who says refugees returning home will find it hard to have a normal life, lack of employment, medical services, as Noor Jahan mentioned earlier. Another person says too often returnees bring invaluable skills to Afghanistan. They thrive more in Afghanistan than outside. But Noor Jahan, if there are no jobs for them, how can they, and are they? I know people must be finding a way around the obstacles they face.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really important to think about. A lot of refugees who have had the chance to go to school outside and get an education do bring invaluable skills. But I cannot count the number of Afghan women and men I know who have BAs and don't have jobs, who are not given the opportunity to really be part of the society because they don't have the networks. And we know the system of getting jobs in Afghanistan, especially in Kabul, is incredibly competitive, and it's very much who you know, business of who you know. I also like that everyone is talking about how everyone is being returned to Kabul, as there's a little more opportunity there, but Kabul is one of the least safe places to be returned to. My family, my friends, myself, when I'm there, we are constantly thinking about security, constantly. I mean, nobody leaves their country for fun. That's not, getting on a boat, risking your life and your family's life, being apart from your loved ones, that's not for fun and games. That's a really huge, important, difficult decision, really personal decision. And then you're returned back to Kabul, where there's a suicide attack every other week. And you literally don't know if you're going to be alive when you get out of the house in the morning, or if your children are gonna come back home after going to school. I think these are really complex issues, and the political really impacts the personal. I know that there are reasons why European leaders are decreasing number of asylees they're taking and immigrants they're taking, but I think we cannot ignore that there's a catastrophic life waiting for many people who return to Afghanistan. Just recently, we had an Afghan professor who had studied abroad and returned to Afghanistan get killed at American University of Afghanistan. That is, to me, heartbreaking. If he had been alive, he could have participated in Afghanistan in some other way, from outside and from the safety of where he went to school, but we no longer have them. And Afghans, we cannot be sacrificial lambs anymore. Like my generation, I refuse to be a sacrificial lamb. I think I can be effective for Afghanistan, but my government has to provide me with the very basics, which is security, which is knowing that I will be alive.
Let me just bring in Naseem. Naseem, go ahead.
Yeah, on that note, what the government can provide Afghans returning, one of your tweets earlier on Twitter mentioned that returnees are coming back to a country that's far less capable to help them than the countries of exile or the countries they're going to. And we have a representative here of the government, and it's important to mention that the government doesn't have a comprehensive migration policy at this stage. There is a policy framework that's been developed for returnees and IDPs, but it hasn't even yet begun entering the stages of implementation. So we're facing 1 million returns last year, 1 million returns next year, and yet there is no real plan to be able to deliver services to them. All of that is under development, and the government really needs support from those outside of the country to be able to implement such plans. Right now, resources funding is decreasing to Afghanistan. Humanitarian needs are huge, But beyond that, development needs, urban planning needs are extremely consequential.
Naseem,
So
let me
if
just check.
anyone-
Let me just check. We're right at the end of the show. I want to just check in here with Javeed. Javeed, do you have a strategy for the returnees coming back to Afghanistan? What is the plan?
Let me just add some more to the words Nurjahan had about safety in Afghanistan and the refugees. I will agree to her that some refugees are seeking refuge or they are worried about their security. But when we talk about Afghans born outside, born abroad and raised abroad and gotten educated outside of the country, like let's say in Iran, in Pakistan, in Russia and in Ukraine, and they are leaving those countries to seek refuge in Germany or in Sweden after 20 years staying in Russia. I don't think they are seeking refuge because of security reasons. The ones who are fleeing Afghanistan for security reasons, we should agree to them. But the ones who are leaving Russia to seek a better life in Germany, I don't think those are fleeing Russia because of security. So
okay,
let's have some
Javeed, let me just go back to this because we're right at the end of the show and I
people.
asked you something very directly. What is the plan, the strategy for returnees? The estimate is 1,500 coming back into Afghanistan every day. What can you tell them?
Well, Afghanistan is their home ultimately. If they don't get accepted by the European nations, if Germany or others don't accept them as refugees or asylum seekers, they should have somewhere to go, and Afghanistan is their address. We, as a responsible government, are paying attention to their needs. First, their shelters. The ones who have left Afghanistan, they have lost whatever they had here. So when they come back, they should have somewhere to stay, to rest. The first thing we do is to make sure that they have shelters, that they can go back to their ancestral lands, or that they can choose living in the major cities, in the urban areas. The second priority for us is to make sure that they have access to health and education services. I don't agree with the words that we don't have a clear policy. If there is no clear policy, we won't be signing any agreement with the EU nations. We do have a clear policy on refugees and returnees and also on the IDPs, and this is our priority. They are also part of our national peace and development framework that we have developed recently. There are new towns planned to be built for refugees in the east, in the south, and in the west, and also in Kabul for refugees.
Okay, so Javeed, I hear you, and I just want to correct myself. 1,500 Afghans displaced on a daily basis. Naseem, what did you want to add?
Just to specify that these are plans that the government has. For example, the policy framework was launched and published in December 2016. All of this is very new and it will take time to implement. But remember again that we focus the conversation on the EU, yet there's a humanitarian crisis in the East. There's a humanitarian crisis also for those being deported in the West, and those are by far the largest numbers. The women that I've spoken to in Jalalabad city, there are 4 families living in one single
Naseem,
house.
we're right at the end of this show. I'm going to pick up. We'll pick up in our post show at stream.outerzero.com. If you want to know what Naseem's story was going to be, we'll pick up there. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll be back online at stream.outerzero.com. Thanks for watching. Hello, and welcome back. We're talking about refugees and internally displaced people in Afghanistan right now. Naseem, you were just about to launch into a story as I was wrapping up the show. Sorry about that. That is why we have a post show. Just recap and tell us what you wanted to share with us.
Sure, just the story of this one woman who's the head of her own household who came back with 6 children, half of whom only are able to go to school because she can't afford anymore. But she came back to Jalalabad city, so to the main city next to the Pakistani border, and she lives with 4 other families in the same home. So this question of occupancy, multi-occupancy rate is huge at the moment in Jalalabad city, multiple families living in the same home. So while the housing needs are huge, the housing plans are still unclear for these people. They still don't know if they will be given any shelter, any housing, and they're just doing their best out of their own networks, living with their relatives. So in terms of providing them for shelter, when will the first housing units be delivered? When will a shelter plan be implemented? These are the questions that these women have shared with us, and maybe the other participants would like to talk to that.
Nurjahan, I know that's exactly what you wanted to talk about, what some of the women-led efforts in Afghanistan look like.
Sure. Well, I wanted to specifically speak about how this issue, this lack of safe space, this lack of space in general impacts women. Women refugees live often in the same, in huge rooms with many different families. They don't even know the family, so it's not necessarily safe. And there are sometimes 60, 70 people in one qala, or like in one building, and women don't have separate bathrooms, so it's not necessarily safe for them. Women don't have access to female doctors in the area. I think talking about these issues and talking about shelter that's safe, no longer, makeshift tents that are really not safe for women, and where women are literally kept as almost prisoners because they're not allowed to go out there in a new environment. The tent is not safe. The space outside the tent is definitely not safe with suicide attacks. Talking about shelter is especially important, and keeping in mind that access to shelter, access to clean water impacts women and children disproportionately, and it's something that I don't think anyone is taking into account right now.
So where the onus lies on making sure that women's needs and other people's needs are taken care of is something that I want to shift to. Javed, we got a couple of tweets here that I'll read to you. Zafar says, rehabilitate them, meaning the refugees, and provide them security and protection. They need jobs to survive, and the onus lies on Afghanistan's international partners. So one of those partners is referenced in this tweet. This is Taha. He says, Afghans have been prematurely driven back to Afghanistan by the government in order to appease anti-Pashtun sentiment in Pakistan. Do you have a message for your Pakistani counterparts in their role and how they can or should be doing more to help those who are being returned?
Let me first say about Nurjahan's comments about women and their protection and the health services. I don't think the information she has provided are the updated ones. Let me say that we have at least one female health worker in 80% of the health stations or the hospitals and clinics countrywide, even in the remote villages of the country. Today, the access to health services is much more. And also the protection, like even now I'm in Kabul, and if you go out to Kabul city, you can still see family sitting in some of the family places in Kabul, which means they are safe. But of course, security is not as good here as it could be in DC or anywhere else in the world. We do have our issues and concerns. About Pakistan, however, we thank them for hosting 3 million of Afghans for at least 3 decades. But I think the Afghans there ultimately should be returning back to Afghanistan because it's their homeland, and we have to be preparing for their return back home as a responsible government. But we do ask them to cooperate with us, to be a good and supportive neighbor. They should not be forcing refugees to leave Pakistan and come back to Afghanistan. The repatriation should be volunteer, and the Afghans who are owning businesses in Pakistan, who has families in Pakistan, and who are having issues with their educational documents and with other documentations in Pakistan, they should be given enough time to make sure they finalize and they conclude their documentations in all related issues, and then they come back to Afghanistan.
Okay.
Pakistan supported us, our refugees, in the past 3 decades, and they should make sure to be a cooperative neighbor in the future as well. But we
right.
do own our people, and we do feel the responsibility to welcome them back home.
Guests, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's a story that's not necessarily being talked about all over the international news, so I appreciate you bringing it to the forefront today. I am going to end with the tweet at the top of Noor Jahan's Twitter page, because it kind of reminds us that there's beauty in Afghanistan as well. So here's what she says: amid all the sadness, this photo of schoolgirls taking their final exams out in the cold on Bamyan gives me hope. So I'm just going to scoot down here, and this is the future of Afghanistan, hopefully. Thank you, everybody. Take care.